I want to leave you with a few stories. I'll share from either side. So we have the story of a police officer who worked on the SWAT team. He's been on the force for 24 years. And he talked about a moment that happened while he was in the training that was, I found, incredibly powerful. He and his team, SWAT team, were going to a home to pursue a warrant for someone's arrest. And when they arrived, the person inside was a young Black man who had a son and his mother at home with them. He opened fire on that team, and an officer was shot. And in the moment, that team is endowed by law, has the capacity to shoot back, right? Because they have been attacked. He used the de-escalation tactics from the trauma training, recognizing that the people on the team, his team members, were traumatized, and was able to de-escalate the group and peaceably get the young man from the premises without shooting. Not only ensuring that the young person and the mother that was in the home was actually asleep while they were able to do so. And of course they woke them up to let them know, but that there wasn't this, it was already traumatic to arrest, but the additional trauma of killing a young man was prevented. So very powerful. And he was able to come back and articulate that he saw in real time how these trauma-informed skills can be utilized, and what, alongside their tactical training, what it can produce in the field. We have, on the other hand, a young man whose cousin was shot by the police by a police officer in New York 2 years before he attended the training. And he described having an incredible fear of police officers, so much so that when he entered the room and saw the officers there, he wanted to leave. I mean, you see officers there, and Manuela's come to a training, and you know that the effect when you step into the room. She's shaking her head. Yes, it's powerful. But he stayed, and the healing he was able to have in that training by sharing the story of his cousin, the impact it had on his family with rank and file officers, and having them be moved, touched, apologize, actually acknowledge the trauma, was so powerful and so healing for him that he in his own work has said, this is something that he wants to pursue in his life. And we're really honored to say that we've hired him to continue to do organizing in this community, because we're so moved by the transformation that he experienced in the training. And I could share so many more examples, but I think my time is up. So I'm going to pause here, but I look forward to this dialogue and answering any questions you have about this work.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for sharing that story of the direct application of the skills that the officers in the community are gaining in their work and in relationship with each other. So now we're going to turn to Vaughn Crandall from California Partnerships for Safe Communities. And Vaughn will be sharing a PowerPoint with us. So we will be sharing our screen. Feel free to take it away, Vaughn.
Well, thank you. And I also thank you, Fatima. And I'm just very energized by the work that you're doing. And it's powerful. I look forward to continue to dialoguing about that. Also, thanks to the Andrews Family Fund for creating the opportunity for this conversation. Just a process question. Manuela, how do I control a PowerPoint? I just don't see it on my screen. Where should I go?
I'm not sure you'll be able to, but you can feel free to say next slide and general.
Okay, perfect. Easy enough. Okay. If I could ask you to just go to slide number 4 then, and I'll just work from that. Perfect. Okay, so my name is Vaughn Crandall. I'm the co-director of the California Partnership for Safe Communities. And we work with a small number of cities in California who have a deep and long-term commitment to pursue these 3 goals, which are to reduce gun violence, shootings, and homicides on a citywide level, to improve outcomes and decrease system contact for young people at high risk of violence, and to build police community trust and relationships. And what we have found is not only can you do those things at the same time, but you actually have to in order to make progress in the near term. Could I ask if we go back to the prior slide briefly? And so essentially, the California Partnership for Safe Communities has not been around that long. We're about 6 years old, and we were founded by a small number of partners, including myself, who had a diverse sort of experience in a diverse number of cities, trying to pursue justice system reform and police community trust building, and having the shared experience that trying to do that in a large number of cities at the same time didn't work very well. And so what we wanted to do is say, could we take what we learned and our kind of community of support and all the research that we have been studying and apply those lessons in a small number of cities that were really serious about making change, you know, towards those three goals I just talked about. And so essentially we entered into a long-term partnership, into a 5-year partnership with 3 cities in California to pursue what we've thought of as this triple bottom line, right? We want greater safety, we want greater trust between police and especially communities affected by violence, and we want better outcomes for young men, particularly who are at high risk of being shot or shooting someone. And so to do this, we really work in kind of 5 related areas. So one is that we help cities develop an effective violence reduction strategy that is grounded in a partnership between police and communities affected by violence, in particular people who are close to young men who are at highest risk. We also work to develop outreach and intervention structures and programs that actually help those young men to stay safe. And at the core of that is building trust relationships and really thinking about safety issues as the pathway to longer term opportunities and supports. Related to that is, and this has really been brought to us over time by community leaders involved in this work, is we really can't make progress on reducing violence and helping police departments change in the way we need without affected community leaders being co-leaders at that table. And so as the work has gone on, we've gotten involved in trainings and trust building projects that I think share a lot of the elements that Fatima referred to, that do engage difficult issues of community trauma and structural racism and the historical legacy of policing and communities of color and the current legacy of police practice, how that's been a driver of mass incarceration. And so these things are connected, and they take place in the context of kind of an ambitious local reform project. A city saying, we want to make progress on violence. We want to do it in a way that is using incarceration way less and in a way that's building trust with affected communities. And so one of the things that we've learned over time is that in order to do that well, we have to have some good management systems. So another thing that we've worked on over time is how do you manage partnership-based work of this type towards the outcomes that you want? So how do you help a police and community partnership keep moving towards less violence, greater trust, and better outcomes? So just to move forward, if we could go to, let's say, slide 9, I think. Right there, sorry, go back 1 to the 2 slides. One more, that one. So this is just a set of formal evaluations of approaches like this, and Pastor Mike has been going all over the country advocating, I think, really effectively that we do have approaches to reduce gun violence in cities that work. And if we're willing to make the resource investments and we're willing to support people to do the things that we know work, we actually can make progress. And so this is just a body of social science that shows that there's a certain set of practices that if you do them, they do tend to work, they can reduce violence. And as time has gone on, we've learned more and more about how to do that in a way that also helps young men who are system involved have less system contact over time. So it's a work in progress, but we can reduce violence and help young men who are essentially trapped in this situation where they can't get out of the system and they have a hard time keeping themselves safe to move towards a safer and healthier life of dignity. Next slide, please. One more. Sorry, one more. Okay, so this is just, this is the results of the Oakland project to date. And Pastor Mike and I have been working together on this from pretty much the very beginning. And essentially what it shows is over the last 5 years, we've had sustained reductions in fatal and non-fatal shootings in Oakland, a 43% reduction in homicide, and a 49% reduction in non-fatal shootings. And that really is the result of young men in situations where they would previously use violence as a way to resolve disputes, making different situations, with the right kind of support from the right kind of community actors, and a justice system and a police department that gives people the space to do that work and only pursues people who have demonstrated that they're going to continue to be actively involved in violence, even after we've repeatedly communicated with them and tried to help them take the intervention path. And so if we go to the next slide, so what we see is both these big reductions in violence and also huge reductions in what we could think of as the footprint of the system. So over 70% reduction in the use of force. If I have these numbers elsewhere too, but over a 60% reduction in the number of complaints. And from the late 90s to now, over a 60% reduction in the total number of arrests that the Oakland Police Department makes in the course of a given year. So I'd ask we go 2 more slides. 1, 2. Yeah, so basically, just to sort of sum up, I think working in this particular way, in a partnership with the community, with the right kind of support and the right kind of commitments, I think we can make progress on violence. You know, almost 50% fewer fatal and non-fatal shootings in Oakland, a much smaller footprint from the justice system, better preliminary outcomes for young men who are living incredibly high-risk lifestyles, and many of whom have been traumatized repeatedly from a very young age and have had a lot of system contact, and in a sense are trapped, helping them find a pathway out of that doesn't rely primarily on prison. And overall, just progress towards a safer, healthier community for these young men and their families in particular. And so I'll leave it there and just say that as we look into the future, part of what we're hoping to do is just continue to build with other partners in the field the knowledge and practice around how to do this. And I think there's pockets of excellence in a number of different places across the country and in California. Now, I'll name, Advanced Peace, which is pushing the Richmond Office of Neighborhood Safety model. They've done great work in Los Angeles through the Urban Peace Institute and other folks. And there are practices out here that multiple different practices that can produce these kinds of outcomes. And part of what we'd like to be a part of is a conversation that helps those different sets of practices come into partnership. So I'll just leave it there, and just want to say thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Vaughn. Now, Pastor Mike, I think he teed you up pretty nicely. He shouted you out multiple times.
I'll send $29.99 later, Vaughn, in the mail for that. No, it's a blessing to be able to be on this call and webinar with everyone. Of course, Vaughn and I and our whole teams go back. We've been doing this together at least 6 or 7 years, and so to see the progress, I think for a lot of us is not only rewarding professionally, but it helps us to not have to attend as many funerals and comfort as many mothers and fathers and uncles and family members. And so for us, I think the work is rewarding on many different levels. I'll just quickly run through an overview of the work that we do. I'll just share my own screen because I think since I've been on sabbatical, I wasn't able to get my stuff to everybody. Can y'all see my screen? Yeah. So the Live Free campaign of the Pico Network is our national campaign that addresses gun violence, mass incarceration, police violence, and voter suppression. The Pico Network is the largest network of faith-based organizing organizations in the country. We're in about 25 or so states, 150 cities, several dozen counties or so. And our work is really around building power. When we talk about organizing, we believe that those who are directly impacted, those who are closest to the pain should have the overwhelming power, authority, and influence to transform the systems that are directly impacting their lives. And so organizing for us means that we take seriously institutions that house large numbers of our folks. We intentionally work out of moral-based institutions or religious-based institutions because they often are some of the last remaining community-controlled institutions in many neighborhoods that are dealing with systemic and structural oppression. Live Free takes very seriously anti-racist frame in a lot of our work, all of our work. We're increasingly trying to imagine a world that can move beyond the triplets of evil, as Dr. King talks about, violence, war, capitalism, or at least economic exploitation and racism. And so our work is really attempting to take seriously that organizing people of faith and moral institutions must be around dismantling those triplets of evil. We kind of believe that we can live in a world where gun violence and mass incarceration or mass criminalization is not the daily reality for people of color in this country, particularly living in poor and under-resourced communities. And so rather than continuing to focus a lion's share of our attention at the federal level, we want over the next several years to focus a lot of our attention on municipalities, cities, and counties, where we have the ability through very strategic and powerful local organizing campaigns to leverage local budgets to change policies that are not overdetermined or at least decided solely by the federal legislature, and really return the power of governance to the people. We are finding that the lack of trust in government really starts at the local level, particularly because the initial engagement with the government for people of color is usually through police and jails. And elected officials, whether they be progressive or not, at the local level cannot offer a very concrete expression of what does it mean to govern in ways that steer us away from mass criminalization, violence, and incarceration. So we think that one of the ways we increase democratic participation and restore confidence, if there ever was any, is to demonstrate concrete expressions of governance locally. And so for us, we have made an effort to make sure that all of our work lives at the intersection of both systemic and interpersonal transformation. One of the kind of principles we use, we say disorganized truth will find it very difficult to defeat an organized lie, which means that for us, we think we know what works as a community, as a people, as practitioners, but we are not as organized as the lies that are very much institutionalized and structured throughout the history of this country. And so part of our work is to make sure that we are doing all that we can to organize ourselves to dismantle some of these lies that are being perpetually promulgated. I will commission to you a book by Khalil Gibran Muhammad called The Condemnation of Blackness, which actually lays out a very powerful expression of how lies related to criminality of darker skinned bodies has been embedded and woven into the both anthropological, the criminal justice, sociological, and even health systems of our country. It's very phenomenal and fascinating work that has greatly informed how we think about this. And so those lies show up in these kinds of underlying presuppositions that most people would never publicly say because they would never want to be called a racist, but they believe it because we see that's how folks vote and make policy, that Black bodies or dark-skinned bodies are inherently criminal, that gun violence is an intractable problem in urban communities and it cannot be solved, that jails, prisons, and police must be a center of public safety conversations to control the movements of darker skinned bodies. We even find that darker skinned bodies, Black folks, are thought to feel less pain by doctors. They don't prescribe us as much pain medication because we are often considered to either be resilient enough or just not believed or credible enough to actually feel pain. And I often tell our law enforcement partners and others that we are not superhuman. We said this in Ferguson when Michael Brown and many of our other loved ones are being shot to death 20 times or choked out, that we can survive these forms of trauma on our body. We're not superhuman, neither are we subhuman, in the sense that we do not feel pain and that we should be treated as less than human. So these are all the kind of organized lies that we think that we must indeed organize ourselves to dismantle. And so we say that the assets we have in our communities that are not organized, that we have to organize through community organizing and collaborative partnerships. We have to organize churches and religious organizations. We have to organize street organizations. So, crews and gangs, quote unquote, folks that are organized already. How do we actively leverage and engage them to unleash the peacemaking brilliance that we think is inherent within their own kind of organized spaces, CBOs, healing organizations, and then the growing technical assistance apparatus that is is springing up all across the country, and Vaughn has powerfully mentioned several of them, that we now have at least a dozen or so technical assistance operations that are sprinkled across the country that have, I think, demonstrated efficacy and the ability to help replicate, teach, and train other municipalities how to do these kinds of strategies. And so part of what we talk about in our Live Free movement, if you will, is we say we depend on data. And we say that if we're going to reduce gun violence, we want to be very clear about the scope of the problem. The research tells us that less than half of 1% of a city's population drives upwards of 50, 60% of the gun violence. For us, that's a revelatory number, because in many of our cities, and certainly if you listen to the national narrative, all of our cities across the country are drowning in gun violence, when the data tells us that not only are not all of our cities drowning in gun violence or in violence of this lethal nature, but even in the cities that have high incidences of gun violence, it's not the whole city, it's blocks, it's zip codes. It's a very targeted number of individuals in our communities that with the right kind of interventions, we could indeed, as we have shown, as Vaughn used that slide earlier, decrease the number of individuals who are being shot, who are being killed, who are participating in violence at a local level. We also realize that incarceration is something that is broadly misunderstood. I think CNN just put out a powerful piece. I think I saw this, or maybe I was dreaming. I can't remember. I am on sabbatical supposedly, so I can't remember what I'm seeing. But that there are of the 2 million or so folks who are incarcerated, 25% of them are in jail or prison, not because they're guilty, but because they cannot afford bail. And so we are really not only criminalizing the poor, but we are incarcerating the poor, not because they're guilty, but simply they just can't afford bail. And so we owe it to many of our loved ones in the Movement for Black Lives and other places who have really latched onto this and helped create an imagination around how can we buy our loved ones freedom back, right? By, bail mamas out and bail fathers out and these other kind of initiatives that we think are super compelling. And what we think that does, again, is it helps to organize the community around problem solving and not just around naming a problem. Now, of course, the pernicious part of this is that it now does enrich the bail industry and creates a whole nother set of revenues. But because we know 3 million kids in our communities have parents incarcerated, we want to make sure that people can be back home in their communities. We also acknowledge that every 28 hours, Black folks are being shot or being killed by law enforcement, vigilante, and security guards. And that's due to our Malcolm X grassroots loved ones who have really captured that data for us. And so for us, public safety cannot just be about ending gun violence interpersonal within communities, nor can it just be about addressing police violence and police terror in communities of color. We believe that where there is unconstitutional policing, it breeds lawlessness. And so for us, we have to address the intersection of public safety and not center police and or punitive systems like jails or prisons, but we have to think about a broader approach of how to do this. And so for us, we take seriously this kind of cycle of engagement. I won't go through all of it, but if you want to take a look at this report that the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence and the Pico Network put out several years ago with the consultation of Vaughn and David Muhammad and others, this really lays out in some pretty good digestible ways the cycle of how we hope to address issues of urban gun violence, that takes seriously that we focus on the less than 1% of those who are driving violence and do all that we can to make sure that we are removing the kind of conflict or the agents of conflict through either a carrot or a stick is a kind of crude way of putting it, but clear opportunities that give people a credible pathway out of the violent cycle that they're in, and also giving them an opportunity to be connected to meaningful adults and networks and systems that help them make more wise decisions. And we've seen in at least half a dozen cities across the country, just in the last couple of years, as Vaughn has lifted up, a super decrease in gun violence. And we think that, just to contextualize this, a police officer or police chief told us that if you get a 5% reduction in gun violence per year, that is considered like not only adequate progress, it's considered like things people celebrate. The strategies that we've been able to scale up in some of our cities across the country are actually getting 20 and 30% reductions over the first several years. And now our task is to just sustain that and keep it going. The last thing I'll just say has been a concrete way of how we've tried to think about this is to talk about what we call the cost for peace or peace dividends. We know, and we have found that, what we call the cost for peace, $20,000 of support services or $40,000 livable wage job and an accessible human being is literally what it costs to create the momentum necessary to move an individual who is caught in cycles of violence away from that kind of lethal traumatic encounter and put them on a pathway to healing, to wholeness, to restoration. And so we are trying to help, suggest to folks that if it is indeed the case that, say, in Oakland, we have only 200 or so folks who are caught in these cycles of violence, that the cost for peace or the cost for violence, right, $2 to $4 million for every gun-related homicide and or shooting, we know that number is very much more expensive than if we were to just invest on the peace side, right? So the cost for death in our city of Oakland with 200 or so individuals that have been caught up in our cycles is almost $40 million. But yet if we invested on the front end, which we have been attempting to do with a lot of our kind of redirected resources, we could have a different level of investment that actually saves lives, that restores the trust of our communities in systems of governance, and also creates the kind of public safety outcomes that we all want. I'll just finally say that on the police violence side, my brother Ben McBride, who leads our California work, has been championing and building out our police reform platform that we call HEAT. It's an acronym. We call it Bring the Heat. We're training many of our faith leaders in directly impacted populations to appreciate that HEAT stands for hiring. How do we impact the hiring process of officers in our communities, appreciating that we need to begin to vet for PTSD and other forms of trauma, even on the law enforcement side, before they are hired? How do we get into the police academies that have much more engagement in that process? E stands for equipment. How do we organize ourselves and advocate for demilitarization of police departments? Accountability is about oversight and making sure that we have community boards that have subpoena power and the ability to hold police departments accountable. And then training is our procedural justice program that makes sure that we are training police officers on how to engage in policing that is constitutional, that upholds not only the laws, but the dignity of and the principles of fairness that all of us as human beings should be able to kind of coalesce around. So I'll stop there. Our work for us has been a very important way to organize the community around building power, but also building solutions. For us, it makes no sense to have administrations change both at the national and municipal level, and the problems remain the same. And so we think our organizing work has to have concrete expressions of not only solutions and progress, but continue to build and recapture the power and the self-determination of our community. So certainly glad to be here with everyone, and thanks for your time.
Can you all hear me? If you can hear me, nod your head. Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry, Pastor Mike. I was trying to get your attention just so that we could give everybody their time on the platform, and I wasn't sure if you could hear me. So I want to apologize to Fatima and Vaughn because we do have a script and a roadshow, so we're going to keep this rolling. Thank you for your strategies and your wisdom, Pastor Mike. I want to turn to Vaughn and Fatima to see if you all can share a little bit about either the successes or to what do you attribute the successes that you're seeing in your work at this time, or perhaps your reflections on what are some of the challenges that you're seeing at the moment. So we're going to unmute you both and would love to have you two kind of go back and forth if you like the conversation. So successes, and to what do you attribute them to, or some of the lessons that are emerging from the work.
Fatima, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I'm so appreciating the scope and scale of this conversation. We really value research and evaluation of our work, and we have engaged in community participatory evaluation because, as everyone has shared here, those impacted by the problem, and I include myself in that as a member of someone who's incarcerated and as a crime survivor myself, we value having their voices engaged throughout. And what we hear is that there's like, if there's a foot on someone's neck, the first thing they want is to relieve the pressure, right? Take the foot off the neck. But we would never say that means that they're healed, right? And so what people are saying is that take the pressure off, right? We want to end mass incarceration. We want to reduce violence in our communities, but then we also need an affirmative vision for healing. We need things to change, and with our stories at the center of them. And to understand what that change takes, it means restorative justice practices. It means actually identifying. So we're also assuming that in the world of social services that they all too have not, as Pastor Mike has said, not learned and absorbed racist ideologies and practices about what pain looks like for communities of color. So there's a real need to name those things explicitly. So what's been so successful about our program has been creating a trauma-informed vision that is both structural and also engages at the individual level. So people are empowered to say, I have the tools and strategies to heal, and that there's also an engagement at the structural level, what needs to change. So people are designing and problem solving together. That level of engaging folks from different communities and doing the evaluation alongside has been incredibly valuable. And we're seeing powerful results as a result. But it doesn't end there. We require, I think, a connectivity, and this is a theme I'm hearing throughout as well, that the success of our movement relies on stitching together all these various things over and over and over again, right? So we need to know what's happening across the country, and directly impacted communities need to know what's happening across the country. And there's some challenges with that because people believe that the things they're experiencing are unique to their municipality, and in many ways there are unique historical contexts and what have you. But being able to lift up examples of what's happening elsewhere creates hope. It creates vision. It supports, I think, a national movement. And what we need, I think, is the support of media to continue to tell the story of this national movement. So, I think that many of us in our work are also thinking about communications and narrative work that emerges out of this, but it needs to be coordinated.
Fatima, when we were preparing for the call, you suggested an idea. I think you called it a comprehensive report card. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that was.
Yeah, so I've gone to a number of cities who will say, well, we're doing this work. We have this program, we're funding this thing, and don't really get that what's the level of investment kind of based on the population they have, who's at the table as they're making choices about the management and the scaling of those programs. Are they the right programs? Are they coordinated with other work that's happening? Those things, I think, for every municipality is not completely organized. And I think on our end, there's a real need to get together and say, here are the clear markers. When a city is doing it well, this is what it looks like. Here are the conditions, right? And they include things like we call it the healing rate, but I think, to Pastor Mike's point, like what are the investments on the upstream, how are they being managed? Who's at the table to support thinking about them and managing them? So I'll give you an example. We have a youth program in Newark, and they discovered that there's another youth program that's getting separate pots of money, and they're working with the same exact kids. So so like, who's actually doing the organizing to ensure that there are other young people that are not touched at all by either program? Those are the sorts of questions you ask in that's kind of report card. And also thinking about the policies, right? I'm really interested in seeing formulas that look at public safety dollars more comprehensively and saying what proportion of that money is being spent not at the policing level, but on community-centered strategies, because we want to increase and scale that proportionality everywhere and make sure that the implementation and management of those funds are being held accountable by community partners. So those are the sorts of things that they exist all over the country, but how do we round them up, get them together and say, here's how we can evaluate city and state initiatives, and customize based on certain, there are obviously laws that make each state different, but I think we have a platform, we have a framework from which to work. I think we're going to be able to really support the coordination of this movement and the advancements we want to see.
So I just want to jump in here. Hopefully you guys can hear me, Vaughn, before you answer. And I know in part because I know that you all do this work so well. Fatima said, how do we build, some of these interventions, both at a structural level and at a personal level, right? So that we're thinking about the way that we do this work, both addressing the issue of structural oppression and historical trauma, but also having us connect at a personal level, right? Both with police and with the young people that we're hoping to get out of harm's way. So I'd love you to talk about, Vaughn, just how that happens, right? What have been some of the opportunities that you all have seen, but then also how, some of the challenges about, how do you do this work, building it both on a structural and at a personal level?
No, I'd be happy to do that. And I think that fits directly with what I was thinking about the successes and challenges. And I think that will build on what Fatima was saying. And then I also think Pastor Mike has been doing some good work on sort of report cards of this type. So let me offer a couple of thoughts. And then I think he's been thinking a lot about sort of the scaling on the policy change level. So in terms of the successes, I agree with everything Fatima was saying. Like, one is in a lot of ways, if we think that the system, in a sense, is the biggest thing that needs to change, the fact is the system argument at this point is on our side. Like, the science behind the kind of solutions that Pastor Mike is talking about is not, if you take a real look at it, you can't argue with it. So the fact is, these approaches that are, better for communities, better for young men at risk, shrink the size of the system, free up money for us to spend on other things, the social science is super solid. So I think part of it is that argument is there for us to make, right? We're beyond the point where we have to say, we know this stuff works. We can say, we can prove that it works with science. So I think that's one success, just we're at that point. And then directly to your question, Leticia, I think, at least in California, cities are increasingly willing to tax themselves to invest in long-term intervention strategies. So Oakland, Stockton, San Bernardino, Salinas, Sacramento, and a number of other cities have put different kinds of tax measures on the ballot, and residents of those cities have said, we are willing to invest, the average one is about $20 million a year over 10 years, usually for a balance of intervention and police services, that with the explicit purpose of preventing and reducing violence. So at least in California, there's a big opportunity there that with the right kind of organizing, the right kind of partnership, we can shape for the outcomes that we want. So that's one. The second thing is the support on the state level also, as a result of folks like Pico and the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, has also been gradually increasing over time. So now there's multiple funding streams at the state level in California that go to things like reducing violence. Some of that money you can pass directly through the CBOs. Some of them go to police community trust building, and some of them are explicitly tied to the big scale policy changes like realignment and Prop 47 that say we want to send less people to prison and we want to make an alternative investment in services, right? So residents are willing to invest local public money. States are willing to invest state public money. I think private funders, particularly in recent years have started to pay more attention to this whole issue of, police reform and the point Pastor Mike was making, which is a big part of the solution to mass incarceration and gun violence happens locally. Like, we can't scale that and sustain it if we don't think about policy, but we're not going to make progress if we don't make that stuff work locally. So starting locally and then building up. And again, at least in California, it's like a lot of stars have aligned, I think, to allow us to try to scale this stuff in a meaningful way. So those are my thoughts on the successes. And then on the challenges, from my perspective, I mostly live at the local level. So the challenges I see are like the difficulty of making this work locally. And I think there's three things that come to mind. One is local political will. And the tough thing about this is you can get a city that's super motivated to move on gun violence. But as soon as you show even modest progress, to Mike's point exactly, 5-10% a couple of years in a row, it's not the issue anymore. And you look at Oakland has historically been the most violent city in the state of California and top 10 nationally for decades. And they took a recent poll in the local paper that said violent crime is now the 7th highest concern. So mayors and elected officials don't make priorities based on your 7th highest concern without pressure from affected communities. So I think sustaining local political will is a challenge. I think holding a partnership space, to Fatima's point, that gets all of these different stakeholders at a table and helps us work together is really challenging. Because you're talking about system leaders, and you're talking about directly impacted folks, and you're talking about advocates, and you're talking about politicians. And you need all of those people in different forms, but they have very different perspectives. And it's challenging. It's the work that we have to do. But I just say over time, and Pastor Mike and Pastor Ben and myself have even had our own share of tension around how to manage that. And then the last thing I would just say is inside of that is the difficult tension around managing risk. And that's the thing that's really hard for government to do. Government is not good at managing risk. And even when you have like a motivated police department with progressive leadership, the challenge that we run into is, but what if things go wrong? And so there are ways, I think, so just to sum up, one of the ways forward on this is to create different kinds of governance and management structures for public safety work at the local level that are more shared with community, and where folks are saying, we're going to use a broader array of tools to manage our public safety challenges in a way that's consistent with our values. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vaughn. We want to leave maybe the last couple of minutes for you, Pastor Mike, to talk a little bit about what are some opportunities on the horizon. So here we are based in New York. We're hearing about the experiences of California and New York, but it'd be awesome to hear a little bit about some of the work in the southern region, if you'd like to share, or any other opportunities on a national level. We'll do that for 2 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions prior to people. Hopefully don't leave until we get to the question and answer. So you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
So real quick, I think the opportunities that are before us are to imagine how can we scale these efforts up, particularly in cities that are under 250,000 people. We think that the price point for the scaling of these strategies in many of these cities that may not hit over 50 or so homicides is particularly powerful and promising. Spending on the coastal cities or the big cities, these strategies are a little bit more costly, but it's worth it, in my opinion, to save lives. But all in the South, cities like Birmingham, Montgomery, Nashville, Little Rock, Baton Rouge, they have high incidences of gun violence, and they're asking for us to bring these strategies there. And so we think because the South continues to be an important place to play politically, this could be a way to help build the political and democratic participation of folks by giving and showing that they could, in short amounts of time, decrease the number of the killings and activate many, many more people in the process. One opportunity we think just this year is the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death or assassination or martyrdom, as some say. And the Poor People's Campaign is coming back, and there's going to be a big movement across the country. We are going to be trying to use Dr. King's concept of a basic guaranteed minimum income as an extra frame to talk about the incentivization of directly impacted people caught in cycles of violence, and use hopefully a few pilot cities that may include Stockton and some of our other places across the country, Gary, Indiana, some of our southern places, Birmingham, et cetera, as a way to pilot a basic income for those individuals and families caught in cycles of violence. We think this may be an interesting way to just continue to demonstrate that we could indeed use very practical and real cash-based and resource-rich strategies to help incentivize and give more of the tax base back into the hands of our community members and families. So those are two opportunities. I put a link in that talked a little bit about how we use reports to help create accountability and organize. So y'all can take a look at that as well. You're muted. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Pastor Mike. Would anyone like to either chat in a question or unmute themselves and present a question to our speakers? Don't be shy. I'm hoping that their brilliance has just left you speechless. That's what I'm going to attribute that silence to. You know, something that you just said, Pastor Mike, kind of reminds me of what Vaughn mentioned on our prep call, which is about these myths that surround the possibility to implement these strategies and their successes, right? And one of those was what you mentioned around being able to do it in a city that's small enough, that the price point is actually quite accessible. So can you talk a little bit also about what are some of the challenges or myths that you've had to deconstruct to bring all these important parties on board? And I hear you loud and clear when you say we're not just implementing strategies on a state level, we need to actually organize communities to drive these strategies to continue the pressure and building political will. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be great. Or anyone, Vaughn or Fatima, in terms of the myths around getting the right parties to the table and sustaining their involvement.
Well, real quick, I've just found that the key to getting the parties there is structure, right? The right structure. Many times people are brought into the conversation either too late and after the cake is cooked, so to speak, and they're asked to rubber stamp something they have not had an opportunity to help co-create. So I think what we've been able to powerfully do is help train and prepare people to, as Vaughn said, be in a conversation or in a room with a police chief, with a district attorney, with a police officer, with perhaps an enemy, someone they've deemed an enemy in the community, or a CBO, and give them the right temperament to be able to understand their role, their voice, and also the unique contribution. So often the challenge is that we don't prepare people, community members and law enforcement and others, to be in a room with folks, and we just throw people in and then sparks fly and you leave the table before you have the relational connectivity necessary to push through the difficult times. So I think having a really powerful structure is important, and preparing people in the different spaces to show up well is also something we've learned. And make sure we're compensating people for their time however much we can. You know, law enforcement and technical assistance folks, we're all getting paid to be there. Many of our community members often are getting nothing, and they often can feel a little bit used and abused. So how can we also create opportunities for some kind of incentivizing of people's time? We found is also another good way to keep people at the table.
I'll just add one thing to what Pastor Mike was saying, and I agree with everything he said. And one thing I do think helps in the context of that too is the running theme here about like information, at least on the violence work. One of the things that we found really helpful in those partnership spaces is to have, you know, information about what is actually happening locally with violence, because then people start to have maybe not exactly the same conversation, but you're looking at the same set of information. And I think without that, it leaves us to the gulf between the way we view the issue is so broad that I think it can be hard to find common ground. So one thing I think is helpful is just sort of some shared amount of information that people can work from. And then I just wanted to second, you know, I think one of our experiences and one of my lessons over time is just be like, there are community folks that are so incredibly powerful for this work, but like, you got to pay people for work that you value. And that's both about just, you know, people can only manage so many different things in their life and volunteer. There's only certain kind of work that works for volunteer work. And we really value this difficult work. We want to help support people to develop the skills over time to do it. And that just means that we have to pay people.
You're muted, Fatima.
I want to echo everything that Pastor Mike and Vaughn has said. I've said them in different spaces, so it's so good to just build on it. If we do not invest in young people being leaders in this movement, you know, there are a lot of adults who are in these spaces having these conversations, and I think young people's exposure to and being rewarded for the problem solving and brilliance and experience they bring to bear. It is challenging work. I don't believe in inviting young people until you're really ready, but you have to be ready at the beginning. And I think that there's just a tremendous amount of power. I love what you said, Vaughn, about the gulf between people's views about things, I think is emotional. I think that people, I see folks of color who are committed to a retribution paradigm, frankly. And so just having conversations about we are worthy of healing is profound and powerful. So sometimes we have to start there. Right? People have different views about what incarceration is for and who it's for. And I think that those were the kinds of folks in leadership that at the time on the war on drugs, that we had folks of color fighting for people to go to jail. So we have to account for that history as well as trauma and name it what it is. This work is difficult. And, you know, Vaughn, in our previous conversation, we were talking about how challenging it is to replicate this work, because what it takes, the kind of leadership and vision it takes to sustain these bumps along the way is really profound. So I am honored to know that Vaughn, Pastor Mike, and so many others are out there like fighting the fight, because my God, I think if we continue in this way with the kind of work that we're doing, this country will transform. It will transform. I know this. I'm just speaking to the trauma of the moment, right? We're in a moment in our history where the challenges we're facing are just in our face. And for some people, the trauma of reading the news is too much. And for I think many of us, it's emboldening us because we see it very clearly. We see acts of white supremacy very clearly. And so it ensures that we know for whom we are fighting, and we know the peace that we are seeking. And, you know, to invoke Martin Luther King's name and his death not to be not in vain is for us to continue and to not ever give up, and to be connected as we go.
Great. Also, we are.
Preach.
Pastor Mike, do you want to leave us with a closing thought before we close the session?
I think she closed it out great.
I actually had a question. Hello? Can you guys hear me? I actually had a question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Tony. We have about 30 seconds before we
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, well, I had a question about to Fatima about how do you allow for the healing and activating people from trauma and pushing them through to the systematic changes happen simultaneously? Because I heard you speaking about you know, that it should be like we have to activate the people in order to make the bigger changes, right? So I just want to hear more about how do that happen?
Yeah. We call it transformative inquiry, and what it means. So this happened, and you can utilize this in any meeting. You don't have to be in a trauma training to do this, but you have to affirm the pain under people's perceptions, right? So when I talk about folks of color, leaders of color who will come in and say, I think Black people are lazy. They will say that happens, right? So let's start from there. Okay, so it must be so hard for you to see people who are hopeless and feel powerless. What's that like for you? And then you continue, you get down to the pain, right? Can you imagine what it was like, evokes history, right? To have people like Martin and Malcolm die. It must have been really hard, you know, for generations before us to have people jump off the boats, right? To have people who died in the Middle Passage, right? We connect those things, and then we say, so we have a choice. We can believe these things we see, or we can fight for something new, right? So then we offer them a choice. These are all trauma-informed tactics. You offer them a choice and you say, so we can believe what we see, And we can be implicated in it, right? We can like get hooked by it, or we can imagine something new and we can fight for that. This is an invitation here to fight for something new. That doesn't mean we're not going to feel frustrated and disappointed by what we see, but it does mean that we get to be hopeful and stand for those people who have challenges standing for themselves, because they will stand for themselves. And that's our work. Our work is to meet people where they are and allow them to stand for themselves. And that line of inquiry is very powerful. It's very evocative, and people wake up. And in any setting, in any meeting, if you see that sort of trauma showing up, I invite you to use transformative inquiry to get to the heart of it and to invoke the names of those who are not there, and the stories of those who are not there, and hopefully they're in the room with you. And it produces, I think, a level of cohesion that allows the groups to move forward.
So much, Fatima, and I do apologize, everyone, that we do have to bring our learning session to a close, but I want to just acknowledge Retta from Annie Casey, who sent along a comment, and I hope I'm saying your name right, Kaylin from Girls for Gender Equity, who wanted to learn a little more about how you all are addressing gender-based violence in your trauma-informed practices. We just want to thank all of our speakers for taking the time out to share their really critical work. We want to thank the funders who joined this call because they're interested in learning more about trauma-informed practice and the visionary work of our leaders here in the communities that they represent. We want to acknowledge our beloved board members who are also doubling down on their own learning to be in better allyship with our grantee partners, and our fellow colleagues here at CERTA who had cookies in the other room and are learning right along with us. I would like to invite all of you to right away chat in your name or your organization into the chat box so that everyone can see who was in this sacred circle. And let us know if you would like to remain on the mailing list to invite you to the upcoming learning sessions. We're having a learning session quarterly highlighting the work of our grantees. The next one should be sometime in March, looking at intersections between the justice system and immigration. So with that being said, thank you all for joining us. We're really delighted to have had your expertise and your undying leadership on this work. So we send you many blessings, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you all, everyone. Have a blessed Monday. Keep on learning.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On just to capture. You need us though.